All right, welcome to the second part of our two-part lecture talking about the historical background of the modern nation state. We're going to focus in this slideshow specifically on colonialism and what it's meant in terms of modern nation states. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture. I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, when we're talking about states and nations, if you remember back to our last lecture, part of what we talked about were what those two terms mean. And remember, states, we're talking about actual governing bodies that have defined territories, they've got stable populations, and they've got control over those territories. Okay, so what happens in them, and they're able to maintain borders. Nations, on the other hand, are cultural groups that are self-defined most often, that may or may not have control over their own territory, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today is various geographic manifestations of states and nations and what that means. Okay. So we talk about multi-state nations, and really we're going to talk about multi-state nations, multinational states, and then stateless nations. Okay, so three different geographic permutations of this combination of state and nation. Nearly every country in the world is a multinational state, meaning it's got more than one nation or more than one cultural group inside its borders. There's really only a handful of examples where we've got countries that are all or almost entirely a single ethnic group. Okay, so a multinational state has more than one nation within its borders. When the nation stretches across borders or across states, on the other hand, so we've got a cultural group that's not within one state but rather within several, we call that a multi-state nation. Okay, so it's a cultural group that stretches across political borders. When multiple nations or states claim attachments to the same piece of territory, the potential for conflict is significant. A great example of multiple nations or states claiming attachments to the same territory, all of the conflict in Israel is a great example of this. We've got the Palestinians and we've got the Israelis both claiming the same piece of territory, both with very significant historical claims, cultural claims, right? And it's led to a huge amount of conflict in terms of who's going to control the territory and what does that mean for the other group. Another example, another complication that can arise from a lack of fit between nations and states is that not all nations have a state. Okay, so all multi-state nations are stateless nations. Not all stateless nations are multi-state nations, if that makes sense. So a great example, though, of a stateless nation that is a multi-state nation are the Kurds, right? And the Kurds have a defined homeland. You can see it on the map here, right? That spans 4 or 5 countries. And off and on over really the last 30 to 50 years, the Kurds have been fighting to establish their own homeland. They're at about 2.5 million people. They're one of the biggest ethnic groups that does not have their own country. Okay, so they've been fighting in various countries for various lengths of time to establish control, and with different degrees of success. So for instance, in Iraq, that whole northern corner of Iraq that's labeled Kurdistan is for the most part an autonomous territory. That means that they report back to the Iraqi government, but essentially they're self-governing, a lot like a state here in the United States. Okay. In Turkey, on the other hand, the Kurds have been fighting and fighting and fighting, and they had reached a ceasefire for a while with the Turkish government. And then with everything that's going on in Syria, tensions have flamed back up, and now the Kurds and the Turks are fighting again over who's going to have control of that Kurdish dominated territory in eastern Turkey and what that's really going to mean for that territory, right? Because for a lot of years, for example, Kurds in Turkey have not been able to go to school in their own language, learn their own history, and things like that. So that's what we're looking at as the end result of colonialism, is this combination of nations and states. Okay, But when we bring it back and we start talking about colonialism and the diffusion of the nation state model, then we got to go back a little bit historically, and then we'll come back up and we'll look again at some of what that's meant for the world. So when we're talking about colonialism, part of what you need to understand is that using the colonial system, Europe really exports these ideas of state, these ideas of sovereignty, and this idea of nation states, which again, national groups that have their own country, to much of the rest of the world, really through two waves of colonialism. That earlier wave, which encompasses North America and some parts, ultimately, I think, of Africa, and then of Asia, and then the second wave, which ultimately encompasses Africa and much of the remainder of Asia. Okay. And during the heyday of colonialism, when it was at its height, those imperial powers really are exercising pretty ruthless control over their domains, and they're organizing them in such a way that they're maximizing the economic exploitation, which means for the most part they're minimizing things like education, like diversified economies, okay, things like that. So their goal, and we talked about this with the last lecture, is to take resources out of the colonies, manufacture them and turn them into finished products at home, and then send them back to the colonies and sell them. Okay, and this manages to serve two functions. The first function is when we're pulling resources out of the colonies that we're providing jobs in the manufacturing sector, which is higher pay than the primary sector at home. And then when we turn around and we sell them, what we're doing is we're keeping our prices high enough to enable our manufacturers to stay in business. Okay, so that again, they're maximizing exploitation. The colonies are getting exploited coming and going economically. Okay, colonialism, for the most part, has ended. Okay, there's very, very few areas of the world that are still colonies. But the important piece and the reason why we study it in geography is that that political organization of state and of space persists. This really is this model of state and nation state and sovereignty. This is the model for the modern political system of the world. And the economic system that was set up during colonialism is really the kind of the model. It's what we use today to guide our global world economy, right? And it's from this colonial system that we ultimately developed that core periphery model, right? Remember, the core are the colonizers, by and large, and the periphery are the colonized. And then you get the occasional lucky periphery country that has managed to move out of periphery and not all the way to core, but also not all the way to periphery, and we call those semi-periphery. So this is our last slide, by the way, looking at a world map. We'll take it back to and talk a little bit about what this has meant for the world today. What we're really looking at with our world scale map is who the dominant colonial influences were in different areas of the world. So for example, if we take, say, Great Britain, you can see it US, Canada, right? But also large parts of Southeast Asia, large parts of Africa. They've got kind of a strip down there going from northern to southern Africa, right? A little bit in the Middle East, Australia. Portugal, not so much. Really, Brazil's the big Portuguese influence with a couple of spots in Africa, right? France ends up with huge territorial influence in Africa, a little bit in Southeast Asia, right? Spain, most of their influence is in South America, Central America, right? One that may surprise you is Belgium, and Belgium carves out a huge territory, especially compared to the size of Belgium, in kind of the middle of sub-Saharan Africa and the Congo region. And the treatment of the Congolese by the Belgians really is something that persists until today and continues to cause problems in that region today in terms of economic development and the like. Right? Other influences that you maybe didn't know about: Italy has some major influence in parts of Africa, right? Japan in Southeast Asia, we don't talk a lot, or in Eastern Asia, we don't talk a lot about Japan and Asia, but that was kind of a pretty big colonial influence. Turkey, has a huge influence, especially when we look at the Ottoman Empire, right? A little bit with Denmark mostly there, in Iceland, Greenland, right? Got Russia colonization going on all over Eastern Europe into Asia, right? Really what ends up happening with this colonial system is that it spreads from one corner of the world to the other. Some people end up on top, some people end up on bottom, and the influence of that is still seen and felt in where we draw the lines on the map, right? So where we find the states. It's seen and felt when we talk about all the different nations that are multi-state nations and all the states that are multi-nation states. Certainly when we're talking about our stateless nations, they're a little bit PO'd, for lack of a better term, about the way the lines on the map were drawn, right? Because remember, our stateless nations want control over their homeland and don't have it. Okay. And so we got to understand a little bit about colonialism, and we got to understand a little bit about the political geography of the world in order to understand and to tie it back and link back to some of that economic geography we've talked about, right? Where do we find the core? Where do we find the periphery? Why are those relationships in existence? Okay. How does such a small corner of the world in Europe come to dominate so much of the rest of the world? In Africa, large parts of Asia, right? Central South America, and so forth. These are all good geographic questions that we need to ask, we need to understand if we're going to understand the world we live in today. So just to kind of recap and wrap up, we've gone through, defined the idea of stateless nations, multi-nation states, and multi-state nations. We've talked about the impacts of colonialism on each of those and what that has really meant for the world in terms of the modern economic development, political development of the world. Again, where we draw the lines on the map and where we find the core versus periphery, right? And it's from this colonial perspective that we get even a lot of our critiques of some of those models. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just feel free to come see me during class, and I will see you the next time we meet.